Every single year, we are going through it again now. South African students are battling with rising debt despite their protests for free education. It's historical debt, which is a problem because inevitably it starts every academic year with student protest because of registration and financial issues. It's incredibly expensive to get into a university. Well, some institutions are trying to come up with creative ways of addressing what some are calling this debt crisis. Here's a good example. The Walter Sisulu Council has announced a debt forgiveness program. So how exactly does that work? Well, I'm joined by the university's council chairperson, Advocate Tembeka Ngcukaitobi, here on the show this afternoon. Advocate, thank you very much for coming in. So can we talk about what is a debt forgiveness program and why go with this as a way forward? Good afternoon.
Thank you, and thank you for having us here. Let's start with the second question, which is why. In a sense, you've already spoken to this, that there is a general crisis facing higher education, which is the crisis of student debt. It's obviously both historical and contemporary crisis, and the cause for it, most of us are familiar with, is the socio-economic climate in South Africa. It's the shrinking middle class, its declining incomes, and its expansion and universalization of higher education. If you open the doors of higher learning to all, how do you finance it? One of the critical problems we have is NSFAS is not covering everyone. And even where it does cover certain students, there are years that it misses, and certain instances it's got certain caps. There is very little funding available for the private sector that's funding bursaries, and parents simply cannot afford. So that's the why. What that means for universities, specifically black universities like the Walter Sisulu University, is that they have to carry the burden of student indebtedness. The students owe us, we are the accreditors, but we can't collect because of the socio-economic challenges. So that is why I'm answering the first question now. That is why this weekend, on Friday last week, we worked in collaboration with our convocation to initiate a dedicated debt clearance fund. The contribution of the council that I lead in that debt clearance fund is R1 million of debt forgiveness. That's where we simply write off the debt for specific categories of students. We can't obviously write off all of the 800 million that we are owed by past students or the 500 million that we are owed by current students, but we can make a start. But what happened as a result of the announcement that we made is that we triggered a series of contributions and donations from the private sector, from the state. The Eastern Cape government, you'd be surprised to learn this, has contributed 20 million rands. The university management under the Vice Chancellor has divided a scheme in which it has enabled about 8 million rands to be available. There are a range of private sector initiatives that have come into it. They will announce themselves. I don't want to announce them on television. But in total, what we were able to raise in one night of the launch of the program is around 40 million rands. Now that's a significant amount, but it shows that we can catalyze a range of contributions to reach, I mean, my target at the moment is reaching 100 million. But as long as it's dedicated, it's specific, and it releases black students from the albatross of debt and enables them to obtain their certificates and to look for jobs.
And I think that's the important part, because I was about to ask you exactly what you raised at the end, because without having your student debt paid, certificates and qualifications don't get handed out, which means you can't then go on into the workplace. And I think this is what many people might not understand when we talk about student debt.
Yes, no, that's the crisis that one faces, is that I don't know a single university in this country that releases either the results, the printout, or the certificate if the fees have not been paid. And it's a problem because a student has NSFAS approval, and sometimes it's not sufficient, and sometimes it's just cancelled because they don't pass. So what then happens is that the following year, they come with the debt of the previous year, and we insist that you pay 10% of the debt. And they say, but where do we get the funding from? Which is what triggers the protest at the beginning of the year.
Because there isn't even 10% to contribute.
Because there isn't 10%.
Money isn't there.
And you know the amounts we are talking about, Gareth, it's 5,000 rands, it's 6,000 rands, it's 10,000 rands. But there's a lot of private capital in private hands. The question we were asking on Friday is how do you galvanize that private capital into the social good of education? And that's what we want to challenge the private sector with.
Are we, and I think many people would agree that this is one solution moving in the right direction. I don't think anybody would argue the merits of what you're doing. Do you feel, however, and has this concern been raised, where this could be opening up a hornet's nest For example, you mentioned the Eastern Cape government. Could we see a situation now where protesting students can use exactly what you're doing now as a good turn for students, use this as ammunition later to say, see, it can be done, why aren't you doing it for us at other universities?
No, I can see that, but the question is whether that's a negative or a positive thing.
Correct.
Because the council that I lead at WUSU, we don't see ourselves as being in an antagonistic relationship with the students. We actually see ourselves as being on the same side as the students. This is a cry that they've had. I've been in that council for 3 years, and every year we take over the burden. We know we have to register the students. We can't turn them away. And when we register them, we ask them to sign acknowledgements of debts. We know that they will not pay those acknowledgement of debts because we know that it's going to take at least 3 years to obtain employment. And when they
can't do without a certificate.
Because they don't have the certificate. And when they do obtain the employment, it's not meaningful enough to enable them to repay and at the same time to support their families. And so that is why I think that if it triggers a range of demands that the policy of the state ought to focus on the social good of education, then that is a good thing.
Does this not bring us back to a much bigger question? This is a solution to a problem.
Yes.
Perhaps we go back to a problem one in this case, as we heard from the SRC president at Wits University, was free education. The ANC government, and I'm quoting, I think fairly closely, let me paraphrase rather, the ANC government promised us free education. If there was free education, you wouldn't have to do what you're doing now. Is that realistic to your mind, a thing such as free higher education?
Well, the question is how do you, there's nothing called free education.
How do you pay for it?
The question is how do you fund education? It might be free at the output level. It's free in the sense that the student does not pay, but the lecturers need to be paid, the textbooks need to be paid, even the lecture theatres and the computers and the curriculum that we pay from the publishers. What we think is realistic for now, until there's a big policy shift, is that we have to ameliorate the impact of the growing. There's a crisis that even this debt is growing every year. So we've got to proactively take steps to ameliorate the impact at the moment before we reach the promised land of free education.
How would you then view the way the protests have gone? I understand you're here speaking on behalf of Walter Sisulu Council, but obviously you would be watching the protests of students. There, for example, almost on cue, my team bring up the Wits footage. How does something like this, the way these protests are being handled by A, the students, and B, the university, how does this sit with what you're trying to achieve here? Is this the right way to go about it? For example, Wits, or we can pick any campus, but Wits is the main one.
We can pick my campus. We have protests, we have not had protests recently, but historically we've had protests. I don't want to speak about Wits University, but let's talk about Walter Sisulu University. We've had protests. There are two things about a student protest. A student protest is itself not the solution, but it is a tactic towards a solution. In other words, it's a strategy that students embark upon in order to open the possibility for dialogue. But there is nothing that is solved in the protest itself. Everything is solved in the boardroom. But often what we found at Walter Sisulu is that the students usually resorted to extreme violence. And that 3 years ago, you would have seen that they were banning lecture theatres, they were banning vehicles. That level of extreme violence. Obviously, there are agents provocateurs that come in and destabilize the protests. But where the protests are legitimate, you find that there are legitimate grievances. But the problem is that I don't believe that councils and management are sufficiently equipped in this country at a tactical and strategic level to know how to engage with them. Right at that moment when it's explosive, what do you do when you arrive on campus and the students are banning a police vehicle? What is the response? Do you police the situation more, or do you find alternative ways of engaging with that? And that, I think, is a skill that we are lacking as university governors and managers.
It's interesting because I don't think you were with us at the time. I don't think you would have been in the building yet, but I heard from the acting project coordinator from Right to Protest, Umhle Nchangila, and she was talking about exactly that the students, the council, student councils, and in a case like Wits University, don't know how to prevent a situation like this. They only become reactive after the fact. And she was saying better communication, but that doesn't quite answer the how. in a situation like that.
No, that's true. I mean, this is why one of the projects we've initiated is, I mean, we know this is a problem because we're not surprised about the crisis of the student debt. We know this is a problem. But what we've insisted upon, in my own council at least, is that this is a collaborative thing. It is not an us versus them. These are our students, these are our children. So it's a collaborative exercise. It's sitting around the table to say, well, in 2025, the student debt would have risen to R1 billion, right, at WUSU. What is the way in which we can collectively, collaboratively resolve this? The SRC has contributed 100,000 rands towards the student debt relief program at WUSU. They could have used the money to spend it on, buying themselves whatever the students enjoy. The University Convocation has contributed 100,000 rands. The APSA, the trade union, has also contributed 100,000 rands. The SETAs have committed R1 million rands. So it's the collaborative thing where everyone knows that the solution comes from them.
Let me ask you this before we begin to close. Just two questions from my part, Advocate. One is, how long could you keep repeating this process? Essentially, we're calling it a debt forgiveness program. I mean, do you foresee this being something that you're going to have to do every single year for the foreseeable future? And then two, you mentioned at the start of our discussion, you can't obviously pay for all the debt. It's insurmountable. It's an impossible number to even guess. But you're paying what you can as a council. How do you select who do you pay for?
Yes, no, that's a very, very good question, especially the first question, which is what is the extent to which this is sustainable? It is obviously not sustainable if it is done single-handedly by the university, because the university has a challenge of sustaining itself as an institution, but at the same time collecting what it is owed, because it cannot run if it does not collect what is owed. But within that, it's got to enable the students to obtain the certificates, to go back and work so that they can pay the university. And secondly, it's got to galvanize private sector funding. We have to continue insisting on this, because if you go to Umtata or East London or Butterworth or Queenstown, where we have campuses, there is so much private sector that's profiteering, I mean, not illegitimately, profiteering from the expenditure of the students. The question is, what is the contribution that they are making towards the alleviating the very social conditions of the students? So if we do it alone, there is no way we can sustain it. But if we do it collaboratively, we can in fact sustain it, even including, for instance, one of the officials that came on Friday came from the SETAs, where they said they will match us. If we forgave R1 million a year, they will match us with a cash contribution. So we forgive R1 million, it's a cash contribution. So that the net benefit to the students is ultimately R2 million of debt reduction. So again, it comes back to the collaborative effort. As to the future, I mean, we would like to take a stab at the problem. We don't want to say the problem is too big. Let's shrug our shoulders. Want to say the problem is there, it is a challenge, let's work towards it. It enables us to also reduce the tension within the campus, because everyone can see that the problem is not the student's problem, but it is the problem of the institution itself.
And just very briefly, I just want to make sure I understood you correctly. I understood all of that about the future. On the selection of students, how does that work? I mean, is it a qualification? Who decides who's getting this debt forgiveness?
Yes. Well, we would like to select on a combination of factors. That's also important, which include academics, which include need, and which include agency. So, for instance, a student that comes in and said, look at my record. For the 4 years that I was at university, I just didn't qualify for NFSAS. But I passed with 60% every year. And the only reason I don't have my certificate is because my parents simply could not afford. So we would like to combine it, because you have to put those incentives. You have to put the incentives of academic performance. So we would like to combine academics. We would like to combine financial need. And we would also like to combine the prospects. In other words, what is the commitment that you are making towards helping other students? You can't just get your debt cleared, but you have no commitment that you are making towards other students that are coming. So it's those three factors that we are going to prioritize. So people who fall outside of this shouldn't come and complain and say, I also want in. We have to be strict on the selection criteria.
Absolutely, and that's why I'm glad that you answered that last one for me, because this is where I was going earlier, Advocate, as I say goodbye to you now, that you could have a problem where where some students are seeing this solution and wondering, why am I not getting part of this? But I think you've explained it very, very nicely. Advocate, thank you very much for coming in and joining us. Advocate Tembeka Ngcukaitobi joining us this afternoon. It's a new fund clearance for student debt. It's an important point because I think a lot of people don't realize without your student debt having been paid, you cannot get a job. Why? Because you don't have the certificate that you've worked so very hard for. My thanks to the advocate for coming in.